Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a master plan designed to bankrupt a rival power is actually putting your own financial security and the stability of the entire Western world at risk? And could it be that in trying to punish an adversary, European and American leaders have accidentally pulled the pin on a grenade inside our own economic house? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are the necessary ones we must ask as we watch a slow-motion economic train wreck unfolding across the Atlantic, one that is sending shockwaves from Brussels to Berlin, and eventually to our own shores. We are witnessing a profound shift in the global order, triggered not by tanks or missiles, but by a decision that was supposed to be a stroke of genius, the seizure of Russian assets. For the last few years, we have been told a very specific story. We were told that Western sanctions would crush the Russian economy. We were told that by freezing and seizing the $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves sitting in Western vaults, we could force Moscow to its knees and pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine without costing the American or European taxpayer a dime. It sounded perfect. It sounded just. But the reality, as it is now emerging, is far more complex and far more dangerous. Instead of capitulation, this move has triggered a stunning three-wave economic counterattack from Russia that has caught Europe completely off guard. It is a classic case of a boomerang effect. The weapon thrown at the enemy has circled back to hit the thrower. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what has happened, why the experts got it so wrong, and why this 105 billion asset seizure scheme is backfiring in ways that will haunt the global economy for decades. To truly grasp the magnitude of this situation, we must first examine the deceptive simplicity of the initial plan and the hidden costs that were never explained to us. To understand this mess, we first have to look at what the European Union actually did. Since the conflict began in 2022, Western nations froze huge sums of Russian money. These weren't the yachts of oligarchs. These were the sovereign savings of a nation, reserves belonging to the Russian central bank. For 2 years, this money sat in limbo. But recently, faced with Ukraine fatigue and budgets running dry, EU leaders decided to take a step further. They moved to seize the interest generated by these assets and potentially leverage the assets themselves to fund a massive $105 billion aid package for Ukraine. The political narrative sold to the public was simple. Russia pays. It was presented as a victory for justice and a relief for Western budgets. However, there is a deception at the heart of this policy, a lie that is now being exposed by pragmatists within Europe. The structure of this aid is not a direct transfer of cash. It is a loan. The European Union is borrowing money from the financial markets to give to Ukraine, using the Russian assets essentially as collateral or a funding stream. But here's the catch. Ukraine is a nation battered by war, with an economy in ruins. The likelihood of Ukraine repaying these massive loans is, to put it politely, slim. So, who pays the bondholders when the loan comes due and Ukraine cannot pay? You do. Or rather, the taxpayers of the European Union and the United States. If the Russian assets legally cannot be liquidated, or if they are returned as part of a future peace deal, the debt remains. European leaders are effectively co-signing a massive mortgage for a neighbor who has lost their job, while telling their own citizens, don't worry, it won't cost you a penny. I want to pause here and ask you, what do you think about this approach? Is it a necessary strategic risk to support an ally? Or do you feel the potential cost to taxpayers was not made clear enough? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. I'm really curious to hear your perspective on this. This was the first miscalculation, assuming that financial wizardry could make the cost of war disappear. But the second miscalculation was far more fatal. Western leaders assumed Russia would simply complain, issue a few angry press releases, and take the hit. They assumed Russia had no cards left to play. They were wrong. But before we even get to the backlash, we need to pinpoint exactly where this money is sitting, because that location turns out to be the Achilles heel of the entire European financial system. Before we get to Russia's retaliation, we have to understand where the money actually is. When we hear Western sanctions, we often think of the United States. But in this specific case, America is a minor player. The U.S. holds only about $4 billion to $6 billion of these frozen Russian assets. The lion's share, over $210 billion, is sitting in Europe. Specifically, it is sitting in Belgium, held by an institution called Euroclear. Now, Euroclear is not a bank in the traditional sense. You can think of it as the plumbing of the global financial system. It is a clearinghouse that ensures when you buy a stock or bond, the ownership actually transfers. It holds trillions of dollars in securities. It operates on very thin margins, designed to be a neutral, boring, safe utility. By turning this neutral utility into a weapon of economic warfare, the EU has placed a target on its back. Russia has initiated a legal war against Euroclear in Russian courts. This might sound like a joke. Why would Belgium care what a Russian judge thinks? But in the world of international finance, it matters immensely. Russia is winning these judgments in its own courts. Armed with these judgments, they can theoretically seize Euroclear cash and assets anywhere in the world that is not fully protected by Western law. If Euroclear is drained of its capital by these lawsuits, the plumbing of the European financial market clogs up. Belgium's prime minister has been losing sleep over this, warning that a collapse of Euroclear would trigger a financial crisis that would require a massive taxpayer bailout, potentially dragging the entire Belgian economy down with it. While Washington pushes for seizure because it has no skin in the game, Brussels is terrified because they are holding the bag. This brings us to the core of the disaster, Russia's response. Contrary to expectations of silence or military rage, Moscow unleashed a sophisticated three-pronged economic counterattack. Russia's response to the asset seizure wasn't to cut off gas immediately or launch cyber attacks. They did something more calculated. They rewrote the rules of engagement in three distinct waves. The first wave of this retaliation struck immediately at the corporate level, effectively holding Western businesses hostage. The moment the EU announced its plan to use the frozen assets, Russia triggered a trapdoor for Western companies still operating within its borders. We are talking about massive entities, household names like Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, Shell, BP, and consumer giants like Danone. Within 48 hours of the EU's move, Russia effectively nationalized billions of dollars in European corporate assets. Factories that took decades to build, supply chains that cost billions to establish, and equipment worth fortunes were suddenly declared the property of the Russian state or handed over to friendly management. For example, German automakers saw their plants seized. Energy giants lost their stakes in massive oil and gas projects. The total value of Western assets seized or trapped inside Russia is estimated to exceed $120 billion. In a brutal twist of irony, the value of the assets Europe's companies lost in Russia is likely higher than the cash Europe is trying to squeeze out of the frozen central bank reserves. Western shareholders are seeing their investments evaporate, and insurance companies are facing a tidal wave of claims. The message from Moscow was clear: if you take our sovereign money, we take your private property. Then came the second wave, which hit the European consumer directly in the wallet through a calculated currency war. The second wave hit the European wallet directly. Russia announced that unfriendly nations, essentially all of Europe, could no longer pay for gas and oil in euros or dollars. If they wanted energy, they had to pay in rubles or Chinese yuan. This was a masterful stroke of economic judo. For decades, the euro has tried to establish itself as a global reserve currency, a rival to the dollar. By refusing to accept it, Russia told the world, this currency is no longer valid here. This forced European nations into a humiliating corner. Countries like Hungary and Slovakia, which are landlocked and dependent on Russian pipelines, had no choice. They had to scramble to buy rubles or yuan to keep their lights on and factories running. This increased the demand for the ruble, strengthening it at the very moment sanctions were supposed to destroy it. Conversely, it weakened the euro. When a currency weakens, imports get more expensive. This imports inflation. So when a retiree in Germany or France goes to the grocery store and sees prices rising, part of that is the direct blowback of the currency war initiated by the asset seizure. However, it is the third wave that poses the most dangerous threat to the long-term future of the West: the creation of a rival financial system. The third wave is the most dangerous for the long-term future of the West. Russia, realizing it can no longer trust the Western banking system, has accelerated the creation of a completely separate financial infrastructure. Partnering with China, India, Saudi Arabia, and others, they have launched the BRICS Plus Reserve Fund, a sort of alternative to the IMF, International Monetary Fund. This is a $150 billion pool designed to help countries bypass Western sanctions. But the real innovation is its structure. It is decentralized. The assets are held in a way that no single Western court can freeze them. By weaponizing the SWIFT payment system in the banking sector, the West gave the rest of the world a very strong incentive to build a system where the West is in charge. We forced them to innovate. Now, countries are trading in local currencies, bypassing the dollar and euro entirely. This erodes the exorbitant privilege the West has enjoyed for 80 years, the ability to print money that the rest of the world is forced to use. If you're finding this breakdown valuable and want to stay ahead of these complex global shifts, please hit the like button and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring you these in-depth analyses. Now, this fallout extends far beyond Russia and Europe, triggering a crisis of trust across the entire global South. The fallout extends far beyond Russia. The rest of the world is watching, and they are taking notes. This brings us to the robbery narrative. In the eyes of the West, seizing these assets is a legal penalty for violating international law. But in the eyes of the global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, this looks like something else entirely. Vladimir Putin has framed this not as a sanction, but as open robbery. Theft is secret, he argues. This is robbery because it is done in the open. Whether we agree with him or not is irrelevant. What matters is that major neutral powers are starting to agree with the logic. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Brazil, and Indonesia are looking at their own reserves sitting in London, New York, or Frankfurt, and asking a terrifying question: if they can do this to Russia, what stops them from doing it to us? Consider the perspective of a conservative Islamic nation. They have strict laws protecting their traditional values, laws that often conflict with modern Western views on gender and social rights. Leaders in these regions are genuinely worried. What if next year the West decides that our stance on LGBT rights or human rights is unacceptable? Will they freeze our assets then? Will they seize our savings to fund opposition groups? For decades, Switzerland and the EU were seen as neutral vaults. You didn't have to like their politics to trust their banks. That trust is now shattered. The message sent by the asset seizure is that property rights in the West are conditional. Your money is safe only as long as you remain politically aligned with Washington and Brussels. As a result, we are seeing a quiet but massive capital flight. Sovereign wealth funds are diversifying. They are buying gold. They are moving assets to Singapore or Hong Kong. They are reducing their exposure to Western debt. This means less demand for our bonds, which leads to higher interest rates for us. The risk-free status of Western debt has been stained. As if these economic fires weren't enough, we must also look at the dangerous political tension this is causing between the United States and our European allies. Finally, we must look at the tension this is causing between the United States and our European allies. As I mentioned, this is easy for America. We don't hold the assets, and we don't rely on Russian gas. It is very easy for Congress to pass the Repo Act demanding seizure because the blowback hits Berlin and Brussels, not Washington. But there's another layer of political urgency here, often whispered about in the corridors of power: the Trump factor. Current European leaders and the current U.S. administration are rushing to finalize these loans and asset seizures before the next American presidential inauguration. Why? Because there is a tangible fear that a future Trump administration might take a different approach. There is speculation that Trump might seek a peace deal to end the war quickly, a deal that could involve unfreezing those assets and returning them to Russia as a bargaining chip in exchange for a ceasefire or territorial concessions. By locking in the seizure now, by turning those assets into collateral for loans that have already been issued, the EU is trying to tie the hands of any future U.S. president. They are burning the ships, so there is no retreat. But in doing so, they are potentially sabotaging future peace negotiations. If the money is gone, traded away for a war that is still grinding on, you lose one of the biggest levers you have to bring everyone to the table. This haste has created deep fractures within Europe itself. You have countries like Hungary, led by Viktor Orban, openly calling the plan a red line and refusing to participate, calling it a fast track to war. You have pragmatic nations like Belgium terrified of bankruptcy. And you have the hawks in the Baltic states willing to risk it all. The unity of the EU is cracking under the weight of this financial gamble. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds like a problem for bankers in high towers and politicians in Brussels. How does this actually affect me or my family? To answer that, we have to look ahead at the very real, very personal price tag of this policy. Let me take you forward to the 2026 scenario that financial analysts are quietly dreading. This isn't science fiction. It is simple math based on the loss of trust we are already seeing. When global investors, the people who buy government debt, start to doubt the safety of the Eurozone, they demand a higher risk premium. In plain English, they charge more interest to lend money. Projections indicate that European government bond yields could rise by 150 basis points. That might sound like a small number, but when you are dealing with trillions in national debt, it is catastrophic. It translates to European governments paying an extra $50 billion to $60 billion every single year just in interest payments. That is money that cannot be spent on healthcare, cannot be spent on pensions, and cannot be spent on infrastructure. It is dead money, burned to service the debt of a policy that backfired. And who fills that $60 billion hole? The taxpayer. We are looking at a future of austerity, tax hikes, or both, purely to pay for the fallout of this financial warfare. Furthermore, as central banks diversify away from the euro, the currency weakens. Analysts predict a depreciation of around 8% against a basket of currencies. For the average household, this means imported inflation. The price of everything from coffee to electronics to energy goes up, eating away at retirement savings that are already under pressure. But the human cost goes deeper than inflation. We must talk about the jobs. The $120 billion in corporate assets lost in Russia represented future revenue streams for major Western companies. When a German car manufacturer loses a plant in Kaliningrad, or a French energy giant writes off a multi-billion-dollar project, they don't just absorb the loss. They cut costs. They lay off workers. We are already seeing unemployment creep up in sectors with heavy exposure to the Russian market. These aren't just statistics. These are livelihoods of skilled workers in the heart of Europe, sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical maneuvering. History offers us a chilling warning about where this path leads. We have been here before. After World War I, the victorious Allies imposed harsh reparations on Germany, determined to make them pay for the war. It was a policy born of anger and a desire for justice. But what did it actually achieve? It destabilized the Weimar Republic, triggered hyperinflation that wiped out the middle class, and created the fertile soil for extremism to take root. The Russian asset seizure risks following a similar tragic trajectory. Initially celebrated as a clever way to punish an aggressor, it is rapidly mutating into a mechanism for instability. By humiliating a nuclear power and trying to bankrupt it, we aren't just creating economic enemies, we are creating political desperation. In Europe, the economic pain is already fueling the rise of anti-establishment parties who campaign on a simple message. The elites sacrificed your economy for a foreign war. This political polarization makes the West weaker, not stronger. So, as we stand back and look at the final balance sheet of this operation, the verdict of history is beginning to take shape. Friends, as we look at the balance sheet of this operation, the numbers simply do not add up. The West aimed to inflict $105 billion in pain on Russia. In exchange, European companies have lost over $120 billion in assets. The euro has been weakened, inflation has been imported. The legal safety of the European banking system has been compromised. And perhaps most damaging of all, the trust of the non-Western world has been eroded, accelerating the rise of a rival economic bloc led by China. China is the ultimate winner here. They didn't have to lift a finger. We have effectively pushed Russia into their arms and given the rest of the world a marketing brochure for why they should join a Chinese-led financial system. We have taught the world that the dollar and euro are weapons, and in doing so, we have encouraged them to build shields. The lesson of history is clear. Economic warfare is not a free lunch. When you weaponize your currency and your banking system, you encourage others to abandon them. The $105 billion asset seizure will likely be studied by future historians not as a triumph of justice, but as the moment the West overplayed its hand, sacrificing its long-term financial credibility for a short-term political statement. We must hope that cooler heads prevail and that a path back to stability can be found. But for now, the boomerang has been thrown, and it is hurtling back toward us with gathering speed. Thank you for your time.